In my previous life, I followed my father's arrangement and married Shinjin. However, just 2 months after our marriage, he brought his white moonlight, Iyuyu, into our home. Iyuyu often secretly plotted against me, and after several self-inflicted setbacks, she not only didn't surrender but became more and more determined. The last time, she even went so far as to miscarry. I will never forget the smile on her face as she lay on the ground, looking at the blood-red hem of her dress, her face drained of color, her weakness hiding a fierceness. Shinjin knew that all of this was just a ploy by Iyuyu, but he chose to favor her as he had always done. I remember him entering my room with a tired face, just to tell me, "Iyuyu is like this because of me, she has lost a child, you should not blame her anymore." The compassion in his eyes was all for her. And I was just left with the title of the general's wife. But even this title, Iyuyu did not want to leave for me. After Iyuyu recovered, Shinjin volunteered to guard the frontier, and he left with Iyuyu for 8 years. During these 8 years, I took care of his parents and managed the Shin family's affairs. From time to time, I also had to endure the old lady Shin's anger, saying that I was not generous enough, which made Shinjin leave with Iyuyu, and she had not seen her son for many years. She also said that I was not good enough and did not give Shinjin a child. Later, she even regretted letting Shinjin marry me, saying that I was not worthy of the position of the main wife. In the 7th year after Shinjin left, he wrote a letter back, saying that Iyuyu had a son named Shinhang. Different from the usual letters only to the old lady Shin, this time there was an extra letter for me. A full page was all about persuading me to give up the position of the main wife to Iyuyu. That night, the old lady Shin rarely smiled at me and said a lot to me. It was all about persuading me to be generous. I smiled and said to her, "I understand." That night, I threw the divorce letter I had written into the stove. The day when Shinjin and Iyuyu returned to the Shin family with Shinhang, I hanged myself in the main hall of the house, and I also prepared a fire for myself, burning my body after death, and using this fire to celebrate the joy of the new lady of the Shin family. Before I died, I saw Shinjin trying to cross the sea of fire, his eyes red from the fierce fire, and Iyuyu sat on the ground, her face drained of color, and the baby in her arms crying incessantly, so noisy. With the main hall of the Shin family turned into ashes, I became a resentful spirit, without waiting for the ox head and horse face, and did not drink the Mengpa soup to cross the Naiha bridge. I was trapped in the Shin family, wandering day by day. I sat in front of their bed every night, and from time to time I would see Shinjin calling my name in his sleep, his brow tightly locked, and a layer of sweat on his forehead. Then Iyuyu would wake him up, and she would ask him if he felt guilty about me, if he blamed her, and she would scold and cry, and they would not be able to rest for a night. After more than 10 times, the days when Shinjin and Iyuyu slept together became less and less. So I sat in front of Iyuyu's bed in the first half of the night, watching her haunted by nightmares, watching her curse the darkness fiercely, and then shrink at the end of the bed, crying and begging me to let her go. "I just love him too much, I have nothing but him, I can't let you take him away. Ewenning, I beg you." It was always like this, without any new ideas. Once I couldn't help but hum coldly, and I saw Iyuyu's body suddenly tremble, and she ran out like crazy. When I came back to my senses, she had already run out a long way barefoot. When I found her again, she was in front of Shinjin's room, holding Shinjin's collar tightly, her whole body trembling, and she kept muttering when Ning came to me. When Ning came to me. Tears slid down her cheeks, Iyuyu's lips were pale, just like a delicate flower trembling in the wind and rain. It was the same when she miscarried that year, fragile and heart-wrenching. But this time, Shinjin did not embrace her as always, but grabbed her hand and then casually threw it away, as casually and indifferently as sweeping away the dust on his shoulder. "This is what we owe her, it should be repaid." Shinjin left a sentence and closed the door, never looking at Iyuyu, who was thrown to the ground. After that night, Iyuyu went crazy. In order to avoid scaring Shinhang, the old lady Shin had her locked in a corner of the Shin family's yard, and Shinjin never set foot in it. Shinjin often went to my grave to repent, and every time he brought almond milk, but I hated almond milk the most. But because the old lady Shin liked it, I often made it. He never understood me, casually bought a bowl of almond milk on the street, regardless of whether I liked it or not, casually set up a tombstone, regardless of my body being burned to ashes. Even the tombstone was engraved with the extremely ironic Shin Jin's beloved wife Wen Ning's tomb, regardless of whether I was willing or not. Whether it was doting on Yu or feeling guilty about me, it was always Shin Jin who was self-touched. I watched Shin Jin and Yu's later life with cold eyes, watching Yu become more and more crazy, and finally ended up being driven to the manor to end her life. And Shin Jin, after repenting for decades in self-touch, finally died, and before he died, he still called my name to Shin Hang in a very unlucky way. I wanted to watch Shin Jin's soul go to hell, but I started to feel sleepy, and I never had this for decades. When I opened my eyes, I saw the maid Qingling who went with me smiling and walking towards me, and in her hand was the dress that my mother made for me when I was 15 years old. It took me quite a while to realize that all of this was not an illusion or a dream, but a genuine rebirth into a new life. In this life, I will never set foot in the Shin mansion again. So, I took most of my private savings to find the fortune teller Zhou Yu, whom my father has always trusted, and bribed him. My father has always been superstitious about feng shui and divination. The marriage between me and Shin Jin was arranged by him after he had our birth dates calculated by Zhou Yu. At that time, Zhou Yu accepted 2 gold ingots from my father, smiling so widely that he could hardly close his mouth, pretending to calculate with his fingers, and said 4 words, "A match made in heaven." Recalling the disastrous fate with Shin Jin in the last life, I couldn't help but snort coldly. What's the matter?" My mother asked with concern. "You've been restless lately, crying and laughing, and you even went to Zhou Yu for fortune-telling a few days ago." "It was just a nightmare. I was scared, so I went to the fortune teller to interpret the dream." I held my mother's hand and acted like a spoiled child, leaning on her shoulder as I used to. She laughed and tapped my forehead. "You. Dreams and reality are opposites. Later, pray sincerely in front of the Bodhisattva, asking her to bless you with a good marriage." The smile froze for a moment. No marriage is a good thing. I don't want to get married. I want to serve my mother for a lifetime. My mother just thought I was joking. "Stop pretending, your father has been looking out for you." My heart sank and I pursed my lips and smiled without saying anything more. On the same day in the last life, I also went to the temple with my mother to offer incense. At that time, I was naive and prayed for a future husband who was handsome, gentle, wealthy, and tall, but I forgot to pray that he would be devoted to me. Later, Shin Jin indeed met all my wishes, everything was the best, but he just didn't love me. In this life, I knelt in front of the Bodhisattva, feeling a lot. This life only hopes to live happily, be a widow for a lifetime, and break off the marriage. Just like in the last life, my mother met the familiar Mrs. Zhong in the temple, and the two talked happily. And I left Qingling and came to the forest behind the temple. In the last life, I met a young man who was poisoned and blind here. I didn't know medicine, and at that time I was afraid of being alone with a man, so I fed him the life-saving pills that my grandfather asked me to carry with me and left in a hurry, not knowing his life or death. Before marrying Shin Jin, I stayed at my grandfather's house for a while, during which I was learning to detoxify and understand the principles of medicine, always looking forward to seeing that young man again and diagnosing his pulse. But the encounter in the last life turned out to be the last time I saw him. Suddenly my skirt was grabbed, and then pulled hard, and the blade was directly against my throat. There was a lot of blood under his eyes, his lips were purple, and the knife in his hand was slightly trembling. Just like in the last life, I slightly hooked the corner of my mouth. If you use more force, the toxin will spread to the whole body faster, and then even if I really want to save you, it will be too late. Do you know medicine? He frowned, trying to suppress the pain. Oh well. You need to bleed first to prevent the toxin from attacking the heart. As I said, I bypassed his knife, and my fingertips covered his collar. I saw that the tip of the knife was still tight. Why save me? I glanced at him. In the last life, he forced me to save him with a knife, but in this life, he was suspicious when I saved him. The heart of a doctor is benevolent. I quickly untied his clothes and gave him acupuncture. The teachings of my grandfather in the last life have been repeated countless times in my mind, and soon stopped the spread of the toxin. Just when I was about to bleed for him, I saw a light-colored mole on his right wrist. Shin Jin also has a mole on his right wrist that is exactly the same. But the person in front of me is very different from Shinjin, and even his voice is much hoarse. It should just be a coincidence. Save people first, I comforted myself and immediately cut his wrist to bleed for him. But when I saw his left hand, I shuddered all over. He has a long scar on the side of his left thumb, winding from the fingertip to the wrist, which is exactly the same as Shinjin. The word coincidence, it can no longer explain everything. He noticed my hesitation and asked me warily, "Why don't you continue?" I tried my best to suppress my fear. "I'm afraid you can't bear too much blood loss, and I'll continue with this hand later." As I said, I carefully observed his face, and as expected, I saw the trace of fit on the jaw. No wonder this face is completely different from Shinjin. It turned out to be a human skin mask, and as for the hoarse voice, it must be caused by the medicine. Suddenly stopping must make him suspicious. I picked up the knife and cut his wrist hard, and the dirty blood immediately overflowed. "Oh, why cut so deep?" Shinjin gritted his teeth and asked me. I pretended to be flustered and explained, "I just graduated, the first time, it's inevitable to be nervous, the hero is merciful." Shinjin pulled the corner of his mouth. "Forget it, finish it quickly and bandage it for me." I said yes on my mouth, but my hands were still letting the blood continue to flow. "It's best to bleed out and die on the spot, and don't harm me again in this life. In the last life, I saved the god of plague with my own life-saving pills, but in this life, it's better to keep the medicine to save my own life." When Shinjin showed his killing intent, I slowly tore his clothes and bandaged him. The hero is poisoned too deeply, and the poisoned blood has just been drained. The regretful tone made the fierceness on Shinjin's face dissipate, and the original questioning finally turned into a light, "Thank you." I looked at Shinjin's embarrassed appearance very comfortably, and it was time to leave, so as not to be discovered and unable to leave, and to repeat the same mistake due to damaged reputation. "A hero, I'll go to get some water to wash the remaining poison in your eyes, so as not to delay and become blind in the future." I found an excuse and prepared to move. "Thank you, miss." Perhaps because of excessive blood loss and physical weakness, Shinjin's tone was much more gentle. I walked out of the forest without looking back, and when I checked if there was any blood on my body, I found that someone was rushing into the forest on the other side, and that person was Yu. It must have been that the two had made an appointment to meet in the forest early, and I shouldn't have meddled so much. Just after returning to the temple, I ran into my mother and Qingling. "Where have you been playing again? The newly bought begonia tassel fell yesterday," my mother asked. I suddenly raised my hand to touch the hair bun, and the place where the tassel was inserted was empty. Did I leave it in the forest just now? But now if I rush back to find it, I will definitely run into Yu and Shinjin. Shinjin is temporarily blind due to poisoning, but Yu is not blind. I saved her beloved person ahead of her, and I don't know what kind of trouble she will think of to make things difficult for me. Forget it, I'd better not go back. In the last life, I also saved Shinjin, but he never mentioned this matter from beginning to end, and he must have never cared about it. In this life, I don't think there will be too many variables. Daughter was just wandering around in the temple. Since this tassel is predestined to be here, let it stay here. I walked to my mother's side. The old one doesn't go, the new one doesn't come. Mother will take me to Shubazai to buy some new ones tomorrow, okay? My mother looked at me dotingly and shook her head repeatedly. You're all sweet talk. Daughter is just telling the truth. The mother and daughter chatted, and the worries just now have long disappeared.